Hello, welcome to a brand new series called It's Lit, which deals with literature, um, with various types of literature, various types of novels, short stories. Normally, this would be a kind of series that would be on my other channel, which is dedicated to writing and writers. But because it's dedicated to writing and writers, I thought, and it would be a fit there, I thought it would be more interesting to try it out here. And if for some reason there isn't a lot of interest here, it'll probably go over there at some point, and we'll do it there. As always, this is an experimental channel, so I try out all kinds of concepts, ideas, notions, um, and and see how they go and see how it and if it resonates with an audience, and if it doesn't, so be it. So I'd like to begin with a quote. The quote is a quote that was used by a editor called John W. Campbell, who was also a writer. He edited a publication called Astounding Science Fiction, which later became Analog. And in an interview in December of 1962 on a show called The Printed Word, Campbell was asked about quote unquote mainstream literature. And I hate to put that in quotes, but mainstream literature. And he himself said, well, he reacted by saying, well, whose idea is it? You know, whose specific aspect is mainstream literature? Who makes the rules in regards to mainstream literature? Because he was asked about science fiction in relation to mainstream literature. And so he used a quote that he had heard, and it was, literature is the best expression of the best thinking. So let me repeat that. Literature is the best expression of the best thinking. This is a quote for which I have absolute, I absolutely agree with Campbell here. And the reason why I do is because I think that science fiction does matter as literature. Now, this is not to confuse science fiction with sci fi, as I call it, which is film and television. You know, shows like Star Trek and Star Wars. In fact, Star Wars itself is really not so much sci fi as it is space opera, which is basically more action adventure, war oriented, um, um, oriented genre. And so that's sci fi. When we look at the film and TV, I call that sci fi and others do. Science fiction is literature. And as Campbell notes, literature is the best expression of the best thinking. He's using that quote. Now, as somebody who used to read science fiction a great deal when I was younger, um, and who believes that science fiction is about as valid as any other form of literature, I don't necessarily agree with science fiction being looked down upon or rendered sort of a cast off in terms of literature, right? Thus, when we're hearing somebody like Campbell say mainstream literature, whose standards, who creates the rubric, the template for that? Now, my definition of science fiction in regards to literature would be basically threefold. The first is that science fiction has to have just that, science. It has to have a scientific framework, an actual scientific framework. And it has to have an actual scientific framework and has to involve actual science. So you have to be able to have not only a sort of knowledge and competency in science to some extent. I'm not saying that science fiction writers have to be scientists, although that was often the case at the golden age of science fiction literature, as we'll get into. But there has to be some aspect, some familiarity with science, and some ability to use the scientific knowledge and framework in said literature. Second aspect of science fiction, in terms of my not only definition but description, really, would be that it comments upon issues, problems, and aspects of our society today, as is. That it's about the social norms, the political controversies. It's about the economic aspects. And the third aspect of science fiction, my definition and description, is that it creates an entirely new world with its own infrastructure, technologically, and with its own rules, its own laws, and its own rules, its own mythology. So science fiction, according to my definition and my description, one, involves actual science, scientific knowledge and framework. Two, is a comment on the current society that we live in, politically, socially, economically, or in some other way. And three, creates an entirely brand new world, or at least a different world, that is technologically advanced to some extent in terms of items or or structures or what have you, vehicles. Not only that, but also infrastructure, cities, um, and also has rules and mythology to it, laws, so forth. And so what happens is that you take the scientific framework and you take the commentary and you apply it to this brand new world that you've created, and thus you have science fiction. And so that's my definition, and that is my description of science fiction. Now, I just described to you someone like John W. Campbell. And Campbell was important because he was the editor of I think it was Astounding Stories, and it became Astounding Science Fiction, which later became Analog. Now, this became an important magazine in the field because of the writers like Robert Heinlein, for example, who went on to do Starship Troopers and other books, other novels. Heinlein became a major science fiction writer and author, not only writer of novels, but of short stories. Um, Probably one of the most important writers, and some may argue with me about this, but one of the most important writers, I think, in the field is Isaac Asimov. Now, in a sort of recorded lecture, if you could call it that, that he has, it's available on YouTube. Asimov himself said that a watershed year in regards to science fiction was 1938. Now, why is it important that Asimov talk about it? One, because Asimov was someone who became a professional writer. He actually had gone to university, and he had gotten a PhD in biochemistry. And he ended up being on the faculty of Boston University for a time. But he was writing when he was in college as an undergrad, and he continued to write throughout his life. At one point in the 70s, he was on a talk show in the 70s. I was looking at this talk show in terms of my research. And he had actually been credited at that point on this New York City talk show that he was on with writing 262 books. Asimov has to be one of the most prolific authors. He didn't just write science fiction, but he wrote about science and he wrote about other fields and subjects. A enormously prolific writer, perhaps one of the most prolific that I've come across in terms of books, at least, volumes, tomes. Now, Asimov's important because he not only wrote I, Robot, which is a major classic in the field of science fiction, but he also wrote the Foundation series, another series of books. There's about 4 books, at least, that were milestones in terms of the science fiction genre, in terms of the field of science fiction and literature. Now, again, Asimov himself felt that 1938 was a watershed because of John W. Campbell being the editor at Astounding Science Fiction, and because what changed was the flavor of writing and the kinds of writers and the aspects of science fiction that had emerged. Prior to that, largely according to Asimov, what you had were science fiction, or you had science fiction stories, and to some extent maybe novels, but stories written by pulp writers. Now, pulp was a brand of magazine dealing with various areas. You know, you had detective fiction, you had action adventure, you had romance, you had various types of subjects that were rendered in what you call the pulp magazines, which were called pulp because of the cheap paper that they were usually produced on. And so what happened was that science fiction was generally written by pulp writers, right? Most people have heard the term pulp because of the Quentin Tarantino film Pulp Fiction, right? But that was a term. You know, before Tarantino's film came out, that was just actually reality. You had pulp fiction, fiction promoted and produced really in these magazines, these pulp magazines, right? So prior to 1938, what you had were the sort of pulp magazines. And what Asimov says, interestingly, he uses the term categorically stereotypical characters that were produced by these pulp. So you had these stereotypes like the mad scientist, his beautiful daughter, and of course the hero, the protagonist, right? Usually a man of action. And so what happened in 1938 that Asimov notes was that Campbell was looking for something different. Campbell himself had gone to MIT, and I believe Duke University. And what he was looking for were, as I had mentioned before in my definition of science fiction, scientifically oriented writers, writers that knew science. According to Asimov, the pulp writers probably had never knew anything about scientists or science for that matter. You know, they were just writing just kind of these broad, generalized, archetypal characters. I can call them stereotypes. I'll call them archetypal characters within these kind of throwaway situations, action adventure situations. And what happened, I believe, with Astounding Science Fiction and Campbell is that Campbell was looking for people who were actually scientific, people perhaps who had degrees in science, if not at least had a foundation in regards to science that could write science fiction. And so over the years, you had people like Heinlein, Robert Heinlein, who had, I think, gone to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. You had people like A.E. Van Vogt, you had E.E. Smith, Sprague de Camp, Theodore Sturgeon, Alfred Bester, who wrote a book called The Demolished Man. You had a number of writers. Not all of them were scientifically oriented. Not all of them had science degrees. And some of these, not all scientific writers after 1938 and even later had. Someone like Paul Anderson had gone to the University of Paul Anderson, had gone to the University of Minnesota and gotten a degree in physics and wind up being a science fiction writer and author. So, well, though not everyone ended up this way, it was significant because what you had was a change in the field. You had a change in the kinds of stories. You had a change. And I think how it reflected was not only scientific literacy and accuracy in the stories, right? But I think also the sense of what I talk about in regards to my definition of science fiction. Comment on today, done in tomorrow. I don't want to say Tomorrowland. I was going to say Tomorrowland, but that's Disney, you know, with Disney in it. But to comment on today, which happens in tomorrow. Now, in terms of sci-fi, the show that did that was Star Trek. What people don't understand about Star Trek is that Star Trek was a groundbreaking show in regards to sci-fi because it was about drama. It was an hour-long show that did precisely that. It dealt with the issues of that day in the 60s in a futuristic framework. And people forget that. They tend to think that Star Trek is something that was just camp and almost a parody and so forth, which is nonsense, right? Now, Star Trek may look different to most people who aren't fans, but it was a groundbreaking show. And so we're getting back to literature because that's sci-fi. Getting back to literature, what we have is a new slew of writers that really created the form of science fiction that we know today, and the works that are not only read but influence writers today. So I think the reason why science fiction matters is because of its power, not just to imagine a brand new world, or and some people might say predict a brand new world. And predictability does have an aspect. But I don't think writing science fiction is about prediction or promulgation of what might come in the future. Science fiction, I think, at its best, has to be an examination, a treatise, an analysis of the world that we are in now, seen through a lens that is set way, way, way in the future. Right? It's often said sometimes that comedy can tackle issues that drama can touch, but not deal with in certain ways. Science fiction, I think, can look at issues that we live in, issues that we live with, and the world that we live in, and examine it in a way that perhaps people looking at a contemporary novel or a contemporary short story or contemporary piece of literature might not be interested in. I think that is why science fiction matters. I think it's mattered because of the great writers and their works. People like Asimov, people like John W. Campbell, who wrote the short story, I believe the short story, Who Goes There, though, was turned into the movie The Thing in the 1950s. Um, People like Alfred Bester, people like Robert Heinlein, uh, um, and many other writers, Ray Bradbury for that matter. Um, and I think science fiction at its best is, as I mentioned before, the best expression of the best thinking. It is literature, and it is literature that aims for the best. And on that note, that's It's Lit. Thank you for watching.